first panel, which will be on changing museum practices. We have two distinguished speakers for this panel. Marcia Chuva is an associate professor in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro state, and she's currently working on her postdoctoral degree at the University of Coimbra, where she develops the project Entangled Heritage and Decolonization among objects, museums, and cities. She's a member of the ECHOS, or European Colonial Heritage Modalities in Entangled Cities project, which is a Horizon 2020 project, where she coordinates the Brazilian team with the University of Coimbra. Today she will be speaking about the institutional histories in the debate about restitution, and she's going to focus on the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon. And her text is based on the assumption that restitution of cultural assets is a new practice or an action that has always been a common one in the life of museums, namely the circulation of museological objects. Our second speaker, Henrietta, Lidchi, is Chief Curator at the National Museum of Ethnology Cultures in the Netherlands. She received her BA in Anthropology at Beurden University and her PhD from the Open University. She's previously held positions at the British Museum and at National Museum of Scotland, among others. Her main research interests are indigenous North American art and material culture, histories of collections, and practices of museum display, as well as contemporary artistic practices and photography. She is currently principal investigator of the project Baggage and Belonging, Military Collections and the British Empire, which considers the material legacies of British colonial military campaigns held in regimental museums in the UK. She will share with us a paper titled Material Reckonings, a short history of the recently developed guidelines of return of cultural objects, principles and processes devised at the National Museum of World Cultures. We will try to go slowly so that our interpreters have the opportunity to follow as well. So, do as I say, not do as I yes. And I will.
Good morning, bonjour, bon dia. Are you listening well? It's okay? I'm reading my text to not exceed the 20 minutes I have. My presentation is divided into three parts. First, I will present three theses on which this research is based. Afterwards, I will briefly look at the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon, and in the third part, I will discuss the problematic of restitution in Portugal, analyzing how this museum has dealt with press reports about requests for restitution. I intend to demonstrate that we are facing a historiographic problem which involves difficult pasts and sensitive memories, and that needed to overcome this is the profound revision of national narratives and colonial history. First part. The first thesis is that the restitution of cultural assets is a modality of circulation which is part of the modus operandi of museums. Restitution is a mode of circulation whereby it demands the definition of protocols, rules, and criteria by institutions that not exist yet. The restitutions that have occurred until now demonstrate that global dimension of the problem, and also its mostly north-south sense. However, to include this theme in the daily lives of national museums, it's necessary to adopt an approach which situates colonialism in a broader global history. The second thesis refers to the understanding that the history of the objects whose restitution has been requested cannot be dissociated from the history of the museums which held them. Knowledge of the history of these institutions is seen here as a fundamental step to understand the conditions of possibility of restitution in concrete situations in the present day. The third thesis is related to the fact that requests for restitution involve sensitive pasts and in this political and ethical sense required a broader and more profound historiographic revision. The challenge of restitution involves the invention of new relations with the past and future, as Europe decolonizing itself of its former African colonies by one side, and by the other, Africans demanding restitution facing their own challenges, such as the deconstruction of European canons and the valorization of their heritage in Africa, also raising the need to face the post-colonial challenge. Let us move to the second part of the presentation. In my first, you can open, let's let me. Yes. In my first contact with the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon, I became surprised. I had expected to find an old museum with collections constituted since the 19th century at least. However, I found a museum created in 1960s with a small collection of objects of African culture collected in campaigns between 1956 and 1973. It was a small museum with an insignificant collection compared to any other similar institution further within the Portuguese or European colonial enterprise. Created by law in 1965 with the name Overseas Museum of Ethnology, but lacking its own building, it was the first Portuguese ethnographic museum of a public nature, fruit of a state project in the context of the authoritarian regime called Estado Novo, which lasted from 1933 to 1974. In charge of this project was the anthropologist Jorge Dias, known as the founder of cultural anthropology in Portugal. Over a 7-year period, his team carried out 23 travels to Africa to form the main collection of the new museum. This was a disturbed period in the country since the wars of independence of its African colonies had broken out in 1961, a period when young men had to do obligatory military service and were sent to the war. Sensitive histories of this period are still a taboo in Portuguese society and involve mysteries and the concealment of participation in the war, desertions, flights, and migrations. The so-called colonial wars ended in 1975. The colonies won independence shortly after the redemocratization of the country, following the end of the Estado Novo in 25 April 1974. The same Jorge Dias that was monumentalized in Portuguese anthropology had real links with that region and its colonial institutions. To understand the museum, it was necessary to understand the narratives constructed around this person. While in charge of the museum, Jorge Dias defended the need for a cultural updating so that Portugal could fully belong to the civilized world, constituting its own ethnographic collection, albeit belatedly, and, on the other hand, fulfilling a final role in this process, which was to save the register, the wealth, and diversity which was being lost. According to Dias, the inexorable result of progress and civilization. Jorge Dias stated that the museum had to be concerned with the public affirmation of national unity, translating the singular case of universalism and Portuguese ecumenical fraternity. In the 1968 interview given to the press in defense of the museum, Jorge Dias referred to an emergency collecting since he intended to create a museum which could save the country from the depressing situation in which this field finds itself. And incredibly, those ideas prevailed in common sense to the present. The Overseas Museum of Ethnology held its first exhibition involving artifacts collected in the Portuguese colonies in 1972, entitled People and Cultures. That's the main partner of Jorge Dias' team. How they connected with the photos of the archives, the use to the connection of this group and the cultural anthropologies. An exhibition before the creating of the museum about those missions before, and now entitled People and Cultures. The day's catalogue for this exhibition contained an agenda for the new museum. A historiographic narrative was launched which was reproduced widely in various channels of communication and academic production. This can be summarized in four crucial points. First, the museum was concerned with Portuguese overseas in connection with the metropolitan culture, an aspect presented as innovative and a mark of distinction in relation to similar European institutions. Second point, it was based in scientific foundations of cultural anthropology, distinguishing itself in folkloric studies. The third point, it refuted the formalist aesthetic perspective in relation to objects of black art. And the fourth point, the museum's obsession with its own history, always associated with the history of anthropology in Portugal, led by Jorge Dias. The last point is my interest at this moment, to reflect on the historiographic question and the sensitive past to which I initially referred. This version reproduced in all the material I obtained, and not only from that context, presents the history of the museum without ruptures or inflections, in a chronological line which began with the conception of the project and continued during the collection missions, about which little is known. A cohesive and harmonious team is referred to, notably, its firmness of purposes of its paths. The potency of this narrative, inaugurated by Ernesto Veiga de Oliveira, partner of Jorge Dias, founded a memory of cultural anthropology that was uncritical and averse to reflections on its participation in the colonial enterprise. Alongside the Jorge Dias achieved something else, and very important: the construction of a public building for the museum by the government. Its opening in 1966. That's the building. Its opening in 1976, 3 years after the death of Jorge Dias, within the new political context, challenged the democratic government to find a path for the old institutions of the region and their teams, as well as the African Spoil Museum musealized there. Shortly after opening the museum, was closed to complete the building works and remained shut for 10 years. Reopened in 1985, it soon gained a new name, the Museum of Ethnology. Linked to a research center and with its name having been stripped of overseas or ultramar, the museum sought a new identity. In this period, it held various exhibitions with the collection of African origin. In 1989, in a new administrative arrangement, the museum was transferred to the Portuguese Institute of Museums. In this transition, it gained a new adjective, national, in its name, becoming the current National Museum of Ethnology. From that moment on, the museum appears to have suffered an inflection without losing sight of the emblematic figure of Jorge Dias. Its emphasis moved to the collection work he had done before in the Portuguese rural environment, making so many exhibitions and reinforcing the reproduction of the consecrated narrative of cultural anthropology in Portugal. Obviously, there is no single cause for the rearrangements in state agencies, but my suggestion is that we do not discard the hypothesis that difficulties in dealing with sensitive memories or uncomfortable pasts can lead to solutions which erase international trajectories. While the memory of Jorge Dias has been reproduced as it has been written, the silence about his practice reveals other facets of this history. It was necessary to forget that the bothersome presence of colonial practices in the mythical foundation theme of both the museum and cultural anthropology in Portugal. I understand that the trajectory of this institution and this theme is marked by the experience of transition and the need to reinvent itself in a new political context. This has left scars which still appear today and ambiguities in the restructuring of the state and its agencies, which are the spoils of imperial and authoritarian times. For reconciliation with sensitive presences, it's necessary to resort to the critical work of memory, who also uses its effects in the political sphere. So the new administration in the museum started in 2015, and it's in this context that I reached the third part of the presentation. The first exhibition I've told, and now when we open it, yes, just to illustrate. Although Portugal has material available to ask for or receive restitution requests, these have not occurred in the country. Institutions are concerned with the subject, but it appears that there is a barrier between theory and practice, and the search for resolution has not been prioritized. Portugal did not open for a debate about the classification of the origin of objects and modes of acquisition, nor did it propose a widespread national inventory. A generic request has made by Angola to different countries, Brazil, Portugal, Belgium, France, and United States of America in 2011 with the support of UNESCO. After this manifestation, and especially after the debate about the theme of France last year, press reports in Portuguese began to emerge. Since 2018, the intention of the Angolan government to formalize a request for the restitution of cultural assets from the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon has been reported in the press. In reply to the Angola demands, representatives of Portuguese government had presented themselves as being open to debate. While the declared intention in the return of African objects to Angola contradictorily, we have found in the arguments of the director of the museum an understanding that this is an inappropriate demand. He said, "What does this museum created in 1965 have to return to the former colonies? Very little or nothing. As it was created late, it never was, to the contrary of what the Estado Novo, the authoritarian regime, wanted, a museum of the colonies, unlike many of its European contemporaries." These declarations go together with the mythological version of the origins of the museum and its mentors, who pretentiously announced their fieldwork in Africa in colonial times as apolitical. Concluding, to decolonize a museum and confront the restitution debate, it's necessary, above all, to assume historical participation in colonial relations. At the same time, it's necessary to understand. I'm lost. To understand that for this debate to flourish, it needs to be circumscribed in the post-colonial challenge. As we have seen, although it was created during the Portuguese authoritarian regime, the museum tells its history with an emphasis on the association with the trajectory of the group led by the renewed anthropologists who founded cultural anthropology in Portugal, obscuring what constituted it as a colonial institution. In the search, whether conscious or not, to disconnect its history from colonialism, the museum has ignored relevant aspects of its trajectory, its complexity and contradictions with which constitutes its identity. Observed in diachrony, on the one hand, connections prior to the creation of the museum has highlighted, such as the formation of colonial ethnography and sociological knowledge production networks, in which these agents played a part to some extent, and on the other, the transition experience following the end of the authoritarian regime in 1974, its ambiguities and uncertainties, as well as new arenas in which the destiny of the colonial spoils from Africa is disputed. I have this thought in this paper using a concrete situation as a foundation to propose investigative paths which can help restitution processing in broader manner. In the terms of a global history, here understood as a cumulative history constructed through connections. Transition used to be very rich and complex. Process are part of this debate, taking into account that relations between colonies and former colonies predominantly involved them. Knowing the ways institutions and their research deal with their past is also fundamental for an urgent and profound revision of national narratives and colonial history and for post-colonial relations. To finish, I restate my understanding that a longer-term historiographic approach is crucial and at this moment to favor a rupture with a single history. The agencies used to produce and reproduce them, avoid anachronisms and simplistic response to such complex terms, and to produce knowledge in the terms of a global history. It remains to know if this will stabilize in a field of emancipation or new colonialisms of every type. Thank you. Sorry.
morning, goedemorgen, bonjour. It's a great pleasure to be here in Ghent, and I will try and speak slowly. I might not manage it. Okay. Today I'm going to speak a little bit about this document, which was published by the National Museum of World Cultures in March 2019. I'm not going to take you through it bit by bit. You can find it online, and if you have any questions, you can ask me. And then to look in a series of possibly a wider set of questions and methodological understandings, in part in relationship to the work as has been noted, that I'm doing on British military collections. So the work that on the document that we started to call a framework began in 2017 when I arrived at the National Museum of World Cultures. But obviously, two existing conditions applied. So when we were looking at this followed a merger in 2014 when the National Museum of World Cultures was formed. And that merger was with the Tropen Museum, the Museum Volkenkunde, the African Museum, and a partnership with the Beurden Museum. So it did two things. Number one, it created a new vision of what the museum was for. And we say it's a museum over mensa, a museum for and about people, about contemporary culture, and therefore about contemporary debate. Of course, the other thing it did is it aggregated Dutch colonial collections. So all of the collections in the Netherlands, or many of the collections in the Netherlands, gathered by administrators, soldiers, antiquarians, officials, missionaries, and acquired through traders, dealers, and individuals, all ended up in one place. A palimpsest of colonial knowledge frameworks and exhibitionary practices. Second, was the creation of the Research Centre for Material Culture, a think tank for the museum that had key priorities, one of which was thinking through the Dutch national collections in relationship to its colonial and slavery pasts. In many forms, a thinking through that has been visible in the exhibitions. And of course, none of us operate in isolation, so there was all of the academic knowledge and writing from the 1980s, and then of course the work undertaken by Suzanne Lejeune, who's here in the audience, in the 1990s at the Tropen Museum, looking essentially at ideas of colonial entanglements and putting those at the very centre of display. There was also the work that has been done in the Museum Volkenkunde by Peter de Kers and others, looking at community-based relationships, colonial histories of collections. And between 2000 and 2014, particularly at the Museum Volkenkunde, there was a collaboration with the Museum Nacional in Indonesia, resulting in publications, such as the one Colonial Collections Revisited, exhibitions in Sumatra and Indonesia, new catalogues, a refurbishment at the Museum Nacional of their treasure room, and finally the project on the Singasari sculptures. And the focus of this is, I'm going to dwell on this for a moment because it ties into the modern history of negotiation around return in the Netherlands. And so my interpretation here is indebted to Hansje Brinkgever, who worked as the curator of Insular Southeast Asia at the National Museum of World Cultures. So the large stone sculptures that remain in the gallery of the Museum Volkenkunde come from a temple tower in Singasari, East Java. So that's what you see there. This was part of a website. This is also one of the interesting ironies of collaborative working over time. That website, which was jointly produced by the Museum Nacional in Jakarta and Museum Volkenkunde, was taken down when we redid the website. So one of the products and one of the things I think we need to discuss over time is how sustainable are collaborative endeavours when their products essentially get removed. Anyway, back to the Singasari sculptures. So the sculptures were uncovered in 1803, the same year the governor of North East Java, Nicholas Engelhardt, moved the sculptures to his official residence in Semarang for safekeeping. The statues were subsequently sent to the Netherlands between 1819 and 1827 at the request of King William I, who was interested in Hindu-Buddhist history of Java and had himself constituted in 1816 the Royal Cabinet of Curiosities, which incorporated the collection of Stadtholder William IV. By the late 18th century, the Batavian Society of Arts and Science in present-day Jakarta was also established, and it became eventually the key method by which collections were assembled and deposited in Java itself, later constituting the Museum Nacional, but also the means through which collections were sent to the Netherlands, becoming part of the rights collection, in part at the Museum of Ethnology. 7 statues of the Hindu-Buddhist pantheon were sent to the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, and in 1903 transferred to the National Museum of Ethnology. The most famous and beautiful statue from the Singosari site, which was the site in East Java built during the Indo-Javanese period during the Singosari Empire of 1222 and 1292. So the Prajna Paramita, the Buddhist goddess of transcendental wisdom, was shipped to the Netherlands in 1823. Following the Second World War and the events that led up to the creation of the Republic of Indonesia, the Dutch and the Indonesian government began in the late 1960s to craft a new cultural agreement. In 1974, Indonesia requested the return of many important objects of clear historical, cultural and emotional value, particularly those state-owned objects related to crucial historical events and important national heroes. After negotiation in 1977, the Prajna Paramita, presented as a central masterpiece in Leiden, was somewhat reluctantly deaccessioned, whereupon it was returned to Indonesia. She was returned to Indonesia, transferred to the Treasury in Jakarta, on the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the original Batavian Society of Arts and Sciences. The other sculptures of Nandi, Ganesha, and the temple gardens remain in Leiden. So this is by way of illustrating the deep links that the National Museum of World Cultures has with what you might call the global colonial project. It's innate to the buildings, the history of the institutions, the creation of the collections, the objects collected, the contribution of these institutions to the development of frames of reference, of knowledge and forms of representation. Consequently, as a means of thinking through what we were going to do about the question of return, our first endeavour was that of number crunching. So in numerical terms, it's unsurprising that the collections of the National Museum of World Cultures are predisposed, in a sense, to Indonesia. We have 171,000 items overall, of which 110,000 come into the collections before 1949. Or Suriname, we have 10,000 items overall, of which 9,000 come in before 1975. But there are also 192,000 objects from places and world regions formerly governed by other colonial powers, Germany, France, the United Kingdom and Belgium, of which we estimate 100,000 come from areas that subsequently became independent. And a very much smaller proportion of our collections come from regions that are still deemed settler colonial areas, of which Australia, Brazil, Canada, New Zealand and the United States are simply the best known instances, and they have indigenous communities that may be disadvantaged overall. These regions have long been interested in questions of repatriation, certainly of human remains, and equally of sacred and ceremonial items. So you can argue in the questions of return, the United States, Canada and New Zealand have been most influential with a series of initiatives since the 1980s dedicated to looking at questions of cultural property and custodianship. And this is evident both in the legal framework that is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, as well as the initiatives of the Kapa Tongarea, whose bicultural leaderships and initiatives for return and collaboration have been possibly the most influential and successful internationally. So the return of cultural objects was drafted against a framework of, let's say, increasing public interest, and of course academic work. So here you have 3 reports. The German report, which I was hopeful that we would discuss today, the French report, and to a certain extent, it might be deemed the Dutch report. And at the time, these cases were being, so at the time this activity was going on, we, the National Museum of World Cultures, were also preparing for something called the Benin Dialogue Group. Some of you may have heard of this. And this brings together European representatives and Nigerian representatives to discuss collaboration in the case of the work that came out of Nigeria through the action of British military forces, the Navy and the Army, in 1897. In 2017, Leiden was preparing for this following the meeting in Cambridge, and the meeting in Cambridge broke a multi-year hiatus and was due at the time to celebrate the release of the Okukor, or bronze cockerel, held by the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, but owned by Jesus College, Cambridge. An event that in fact happened last week, for those of you who followed it. And so the Benin Dialogue was being hosted in 2018. So what you have is you have a confluence of issues. You have cases that are well known, including this case. This case is a case of the Ahayuda, or the Zuni war gods, that's been a subject of discussion in Museum Folkekunde since the early 1990s. The Ahayuda, or war gods, are cylindrical carved deities which were an almage during the winter solstice at the Pueblo of Zuni, New Mexico. The Ahayuda were traditionally placed in areas to protect the Pueblo and were allowed to decay naturally. Since the 19th century, they have been the objects of fascination, being part of regarded esoteric knowledge that was deemed restricted in the Pueblo, and thus of great interest to anthropology and collecting in museums such as the Bureau of American Ethnology, that is now the Smithsonian. The Museum Folkekunde's Ahayuda, or war god, came into the collection through an Amsterdam-based dealer from Denver in 1968, at a time when it was already clear that these were restricted objects, and that the Pueblo of Zuni reluctantly parted with them. It's also clear that the buyers and sellers knew this from our paperwork. Since the 1970s, and prior to the implementation of NAGPRA, these were the most successful cases prior to that implementation of that law. The Ahayuda have been the prime example of cultural patrimony returned to indigenous communities that NAGPRA, as a legislation, is designed to catch. So by 1995, 80 Ahayuda had been returned from US museums and private dealers and collectors. So all of this was knowledge. This is all out there. So how do you then create a policy or set of principles that's designed to acknowledge all of that information? So the first thing we did is we opted for the idea of a return, a word or a verb, an active verb that essentially encompasses restitution, which suggests the return to an individual owner, and repatriation, which suggests the return to original land, acknowledges ideas of reparation and address. So that's why it's called Return of Cultural Objects. The Return of Cultural Objects is a 13-page document, I've just counted. And it has these different parts to the document. You can download it, it's available online. And it talks about the national and international context, the museum's purpose. The part of the document that I'll really talk about are the criteria. But our view is that it really needed to be clear. We needed a clear vocabulary. We needed to be very clear about what we meant as custodian, what we meant as possessor, what we meant as owner, what we mean by involuntary separation. So essentially, it's very carefully worded, and it was worded using the advice of people who worked on the Restitution process in the Netherlands and from lawyers dealing in the area of human rights. One of the things we felt we did not need to reiterate other people's work. We certainly felt we didn't need to reiterate why the issue was important. There's enough literature out there telling us why it's important. We also felt we didn't need to reinvent the legal framework. There is an existing legal framework internationally and nationally. So if you look at these, there are all of the international conventions, declarations and principles that the Netherlands has signed up to over time. And there's also the national, so that's all soft law. Everything above the Washington Principles, including the Washington Principles, is technically soft law. So something that we basically comply with. The Heritage Act is a national law, it's hard law, and it puts into scope elements, and we can discuss that later, of what is and what is not Dutch national heritage. This gave us the three criteria, and the three criteria are identified much more fully in the document. Legality. So there's a big discussion about legality. Was it legal at the time? This document does not take a stand on that. What it says is there are legal standards, for example, buying things that shouldn't be bought, which operate at all times. For example, if you buy something and you know you shouldn't have bought it, and you put that down on paper, you are not operating according to the standards of legality at that time. Involuntary separation, which comes from the Washington Principles, what that specifically addresses the nature of consent and the nature of ownership. If something is communally owned, can it be individually sold? Those questions. As I said, I can go through, they're quite forward. And the cultural heritage value, which is possibly the more difficult and certainly the widest principle, and that essentially argues, if you believe the Statue of Liberty, or the Tour Eiffel, or Buckingham Palace are part of national heritage that essentially represent you as a nation, you have to be able to understand that complies for other people at other times in other places. So those are the three criteria. So these criteria and cases that we had in our mind's eye, so cases that we thought might come, were debated in workshops, were discussed with officials from the Ministry of Culture, Education and Science. We took legal advice, so we did 4 workshops, many consultations, went to France, Britain and Germany. I rewrote the framework 12 times, and in 2019 it came out. So there was some justifiable criticism, I mean justifiable in the sense that predictable criticism, let's say. And that predictable criticism is about whether or not people should make claims. Shouldn't we understand that people have a right to certain rights of warfare? I think this document does entitle claimants. It allows them to claimants to understand that the door is open, that they have entitlements to be heard, that we will address the provenance issues, that we will share information with them that will allow them to make their claim. And so it's about opening up a terrain of negotiation. It also understands that these things are done in relationships. And its aim is that it is not an adversarial process. The document came out in 2019, and shortly and subsequently to this document, 2 other important initiatives were announced in a letter laid by the Minister of Education, Culture and Science, Ingrid van Engelshoven, in the second half on the 10th of April 2019. And the first is, the first is the funding of a project that is held in common with NIOD, which is the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, and the Rijksmuseum. And this project is looking at provenance methodologies. How do we use provenance methodologies and which ones work better for our types of collections? So the relationship between following an object and following clusters of objects. And then in particular, something that I'm very keen on, understanding what is the negotiation between Indonesia and the Netherlands in the post-independence period. The second initiative is setting up an advisory committee with the task of outlining a future perspective on dealing with colonial heritage and specifically with addressing the questions of international cooperation and restitution. So in the Netherlands, you have 3 initiatives happening side by side. You have 2 pilots. You have 2 pilot initiatives, one which is one at the National Museum of World Cultures, which is to do with the return of cultural objects. A pilot initiative on provenance, which is this initiative, and the initiative to develop a policy framework. And I think that's a very good encapsulation of the work that we need to do. So we need to have better theories, better methodologies, and clearer policies in order to address this issue. And this is, I'm going to, may I indulge myself for 2 more minutes? I'm not going to go too fast. So, as I said, I do work on military collecting, so collecting in the field of battle. Collecting in the field of battle overseas for the British Army. I believe that the work that we need to do in relationship to collections made in the non-European world by European colonial forces requires us to have a different way of looking at things. When I've been teaching, I often tell students, when you look at a museum object or a museum object comes in and you're faced with a new object, you have to ask it 2 questions. And you ask it directly, what are you? And how do I know that? And of course the first is reliant on the second, but in the field of anthropology, that's where you get yourself into problems, because how you know something is embedded in colonial knowledge frameworks. The people who created the literature are the people who created the objects. And these objects may not be objects, they may be people. So that's number 1. In the field of colonial collecting, there are 2 questions. How did you get here? And where do you mean the most? And those are 2 very different questions all over again. And they're contingent upon each other. And because museums' biographies evolve, and they become meaningful wherever they settle, even if their settlement is unsettled. Do you understand what I mean? And Suzanne has recently said in my hearing that when museum objects come into a museum, they acquire a birth certificate. But we don't really believe that any longer. We don't believe that they're washed and made anew when they come into the institution. So that gives you questions of authenticity, agency, and relevance. And these are very thorny areas in our field, because the provenance research that derives from restitution, from the following of objects and the tracking and tracing of individual ownership through records, and thus the question of authenticity, may be poorly prepared for the imprecise communal ownership, the vernacular objects that change into relics, the formerly sacred objects that are now diasporic ones, the stolen objects that are not as important as the ones that are not stolen, but linked to a national hero, when the question of transfer is unclear. So objects exist as multivalent things. And this is 2 more minutes, I apologize. So, because I've been working with military museums, I've been looking at 2 types of objects. One is the relic, and the other is the trophy. The regimental museum system, the regimental army system in the UK is a very different system. There are 130 museums in the UK with objects from all over the world that museum anthropologists have largely ignored because of a level of discomfort. And so over the course of the last couple of years, so this is my 2 versions of museums. So one is the relic on the left and the other one is the trophy on the right. You might have to spend a bit of time with those. But essentially what we find is that in regimental museums you find a lot of these modified objects, modified pieces of rubble that become these relics, these very iconic objects. And when I think about relics, and when I think about the iconic nature of objects and how they function in museums, So things that aren't insignificant acquire these extremely powerful memories, and this is both in the context of the relic and the trophy. So this is a piece, a horn cup taken at Magdala. We know that horn cup was probably silvered in India, and it was then put on someone's mantelpiece, so it became this trophy. And it started to make me wonder about whether institutions that hold collections are in a sense dazzled by the idea of a trophy. But actually what we have is institutions full of trophies, and we're very connected to them emotionally. And that came up to my mind because I found the photograph on the right. I found it, I mean other scholars who've looked at the Benin punitive expedition may have seen it before. But the army man on the right is essentially reproducing the stance and the composition of the photograph of the man. He's called W.D. Webster. He was one of the biggest curio dealers in the UK in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he's very responsible for the circulation of Benin material. I actually did this for Professor Shillon, whom I know, I thought he might be interested. But what we find beneath that is curios. And I have a theory that the way military men collect changes, what they consider a value changes, when museums start to come into the field. So my conclusion, I'm over time, is that we should wrestle with complexity, that we need to wrestle with networks, evolving object identities, proper interdisciplinarity and detailed provenance research. We need to be better provenance researchers and to have a sense that these are long-standing issues and they have contingent conclusions, but that we can have, or maybe we can create a particular form of transgressive hope, that we can trust ourselves and work collaboratively to challenge historical orthodoxies, to value the work that we mutually undertake and not spend so much time criticising each other, and to produce fuller understandings of the legacies that these histories bestow on us and that such collections require us to address. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these two wonderful papers. I suggest that we will collect a number of questions we have about, for these panels.
Yeah, but
I would just do I'll continue with a good job.
Any questions we can start with? Yes.
okay. Can you move this one to the, and I will adjust the volume. Okay, but be careful with the cable. You make sure you don't walk too far.
Hi, my name is Inke, and I was wondering, since the new framework of the National Museum of World Cultures has been, well, out in the open, have there been any requests for return, and do you see a difference compared with the new framework compared to the old framework?
Any other questions we can go into the content?
Do you want a question?
No. Let me answer that one.
Yes.
Then you can wait. We all need to get into it. Well, we knew that there were certain things. So prior to having the framework, can you all hear me? No. Okay. Prior to having a framework, stand up. Prior to having a framework, we had different types of letters about different types of objects. And one of the reasons for creating a set of principles was so that we didn't answer these on a case-by-case basis. Because my feeling is that the notion of the case-by-case basis just allows opaqueness. And so the case-by-case basis, as far as I'm concerned, is not a legitimate or ethical way of going about anything. And to me, it does feel like the places that have made the greatest strides in regard to issues of restitution, repatriation and return have often been places where there is a framework. So Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada to an extent. The UK in the field of human remains has a very clear legislative framework. So it seems to me that telling people what they can legitimately require of you and what you want of them allows you to sit down at the table and have a conversation. So we knew that there were these issues already. Then, of course, we knew that there's long-standing questions around certain collections. And so since the launch of the paper, I have had conversations with a number of the parties that had originally sent us letters. And so what's happened is we have a framework where people can make claims, and what we've ended up doing is have lots of conversations of a discrete nature, and in which we hope at some point, or we expect, or there may be a claim. But one of the criticisms that we had is that it's too dry, that we don't spend enough time telling people why we're doing it. And I said, well, we can do that face to face, we don't need to write a document. And actually, I do believe that these things work if you have a relationship with other people. So it's in the context of that relationship. You asked about a previous framework. We didn't have a framework previously, although in the past there have been restitutions. And I talked about parameter, I can never say that. And that was to do with the agreement between the Dutch government and the Indonesian government, so it was slightly different. Our collections are owned by the state. So whatever the museum opts to do has to be agreed by the minister. And in that instance, so in the 1970s, those debates were run by the ministry, so there were rights committees. So it's not that there are no complications or there are no sort of contingencies, but I feel that having a very clear statement of what your intention is, should anybody wish to make a claim, allows a very different set of relationships and obligations for us and entitlements for the claimant, which is essentially to slightly change the dynamic. And interestingly, so although the Savoy report argues that certain things should be automatically returned, the Savoy has been very complimentary and indeed supportive of our argument.
Are you listening? Hello? Okay, now it's good.
I'm Francesca Bocchi from Ghent. I have a question for Marcia. Is it only from Angola that there were requests for restitution or other African countries? Secondly, if Brazil also requested some things from Portugal, and how do not only the National Museum respond to that, but also the National Association of the Portuguese Association of Museums. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa, do you have a question?
You?
Hi, we talked about collection management and policies, but I'm curious about the display. And I would like to know from both of you, in your experience, how could the display of objects in the institutionalized space of the museum could enable to bring to light these post-colonial or colonial relationships?
thank you for the question. But on the press, just Angola did rescues for Portugal, but and no answer, as I said. The answer was ambiguous from the National Museum of Ethnology. To Brazil, it happens, yes, in the 1997. And a request for the Ticuna Indian artifacts, but it didn't, it was refused. So didn't happen any process of restitution from Portugal, not from Portugal, not to Portugal, indeed. The only one that had a process open was refused, this one of indigenous Ticuna. And about the display, I could say that it's a fundamental the way of displaying the objects, of course, and how it can help. I can speak about this in this moment, but I'm sure it's very, very important. Of course, we don't have at one time 20 minutes to explain the National Museum of Ethnology, but the permanent exhibition of the museum is, I think it's until today, it's consecrating the theme of Jorge Dias and the origin of the cultural anthropology in Portugal, and they're not dealing with the issues of how those objects were collected, what the history of these objects, how they arrived in the museum, and they are always showing that missionaries that were in the 60s and 70s collecting objects in Africa as good guys. Yeah, so I'm sure the display is very important, but we have to discuss it a lot.
Regarding how you create post-colonial museological displays, I think that's an enormous question, and it depends on what particular subject of the post-colonial framework you're addressing. Are you addressing kind of agency? Are you addressing creativity? Are you addressing the history? Are you addressing, the pathway of that object? I think that we do it in multiple ways. Lots of things that the 1990s have given us, or that we've inherited in relationship to how we use authorship, how we use imagery, how we don't take certain things for granted, particularly the identification of objects by our predecessor. So there's lots of deconstruction. If you there's one of the difficult challenges of museums is you have to construct while deconstructing. So you have to construct an entity called an exhibition as you deconstruct its knowledge practices. And I think that presents us with quite a difficult challenge, partly because if you can't take the idea of, let's say for the sake of argument, art for granted, then putting art on display is no longer a possibility for you. So if you say there is no such thing as art because you feel it's a challenge, something you want to challenge, and it's being created by a certain group of people, then you can't then suddenly have Chinese art from 1600 to the present, because you've obviously just taken your framework apart. And that, I think, is one of our big challenges as World Cultural Museums, that we are deconstructive and yet we wish to construct. And that's a big challenge for us, and I think sometimes it confuses our visitors. And one of the things museums need to survive is an active group of visitors. So it's a much more difficult equation for us than it is for a museum that's called such and such art, and you walk in and you think, I'm going to see such and such art. And so our obligations, our responsibilities, what we wish to do how we understand community-based relationships, how sustainable they are. I think, in a way, one of the things that I came to the view of doing a set of galleries a while back was that what we must never do is pretend that we have a partnership with people that we don't. Just because you phone someone up and ask their opinion, or they happen to be your friend, does not mean you have a partnership with them. So we have to be very clear about what's collaboratively created, what's co-created, where you have someone's voice, how you quote and edit people in and out of things. And that is our big ethical responsibility. And I think it's a tough one to crack, is all I'm going to tell you.
Yes, good morning. I'm Chris Mullen-Kramer from the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art in Washington. And I just wanted to add a little bit more to the question of display. And part of that is, what kind of museum is it? Because each museum, whether it's an art museum, a history museum, an ethnology museum, a children's museum, and so on, has a different sort of mission, a different audience sensibility, and so a sort of a different way of arranging and displaying objects. And so when we think about how to get to these very important issues of, authenticity, ownership, and so on, you in some ways have to take the mission of the museum into account, but then figure out ways through the mechanisms that you have at your disposal, and I would say using technology, which we increasingly have at our disposal, to allow visitors who want to delve into these very difficult, challenging, thorny questions, access to those questions, whereas for many of us here, we're completely involved in these questions, but many of our visitors may not be. And so it's that difficult balance that curators, that museums encounter when trying to create exhibitions and trying to get multiple perspectives into the stories that we tell and the object histories that we tell.
I have a question on the Dutch policies. Basically two questions. The one is, in the policies you mentioned, for the claimant to show, for example, that it was involuntarily taken, or that there were an involuntary separation between object and claimant. And how do you deal with the difficulties that claimants naturally face in trying to show something that they were separated, let's say, maybe not even 100 years ago? Do you accept, for example, oral histories or testimonies? And then the second question is, how do you deal with the fact that you are basically, as a museum, you're a participant in the return debate, but by framing the policies and by receiving the claim, you are also putting yourself in the position of the judge and the arbitrator of the claim. And, or do you see the difficulties?
So both questions have been asked. So involuntary separation, let's say for the sake of argument. So there are well-documented moments in history when things leave certain places. They're well-documented. And so you can, through provenance research and through identifying moments, and that comes from involuntary separation, obviously, definitely comes from the Washington Principles, which is there are moments all over the world where things happened, events happened, violent or otherwise, which created a glut of certain things on the market. And if you're doing your provenance research properly, that can be substantiated. And presumably that's also why people are arguing that they were involuntarily separated from someone. So that actually I do feel that provenance research, properly done, can yield quite a lot of these answers. And so the point that we've made is it's not adversarial, because, shouldn't be, because essentially we have accessible public records. And there are documented histories, and there are clear historical events. So all of those things create a record of evidence. So you've asked about would oral testimony, and that hasn't been tested. So these principles and the process that they then engender have to be tested. So they are not law. They are a set of principles which require precedent, and that precedent should, over time, create, in the same way that it has with the restitution process, create, in a sense, a sedimentary layer of good decision making. So yes, of course, we will do the research. Of course, we have to do the research. I believe, maybe this is comes from, I believe that as public servants we're accountable, right? And this process is transparent. So there is no option to hide. So people do make their claim, they make it with evidence that we sometimes provide them because we have to provide them with the object records in reference to documented events. We ourselves would then need to also provide research and evidence in relationship to documented events. There is, in the original concept, there was the notion of an expert panel for very precisely that we need due diligence done on our research. That proper provenance research should be tested by other people. Did you go to such an archive? Have you looked at certain literature? So there's the claim, then there's the research in response to the claim, and then there's the due diligence that happens as a consequence of that research. So if you look at policy, there's also a time frame by which this should happen. And yes, of course, it should be tested, and then it goes to the minister. So actually, although we can make recommendations, we can never make decisions, and that has to be tested by, and due diligence has to be met. We had hoped to have an expert panel. We've not convened the expert panel in part because the advisory committee happened in the government, and then so, but we will, should the need arise, appoint independent experts to verify our research. Because on one hand you've got the objects and what people, what is said of them, and then there's the research. Have you done your research properly? Can you? Because there will be, potentially at some point, gaps in information. And then the question is it beyond reasonable doubt? So let's say, for the sake of argument, something left somewhere in 1904. And let's say that you know that there were British troops, let's just blame the British for an instance, or Dutch troops in that area, or there was something that happened in that area in 1903. And there's nothing in museum collections before 1902. And there's an enormous amount in 1904. But you've got no proof of that actual thing, but you've got a lot of circumstantial proof, you've got a lot of beyond reasonable doubt proof. And so that's also in that document. But everything has to be tested. I mean, it has to be tested because it's not law, it's precedent. It's a series of principles and a process that require testing through precedent.
Thank you. I think we will stop here, and we will, you're invited to have some coffee, have some cookies, have some fruit in the back, and we will reconvene in about 20 minutes from now.